It's just frustrating because it's identical to Saturday. You know, we've dominated the game, we've created the better chances, we've been the better side. You know, we've got the ball down against the team by all accounts who are fancy to do well, spending a bit of money, and we've been the better team again. And we've walked off with only a point to show for it, and it's, you know, it's just really frustrating because, like I say, we should be top of the league. We should be 6 points, and we sat with 1.
As the game went, lots of things to remind us about. But Andy Watkins, making his first appearance of the season back from injury, gave you a 2-goal lead. Yeah,
listen, he's different class. He was obviously a loss on Saturday. You know, his running just caused his team so many problems. I think the one thing that Watto will say, you know, that he needs to work on is probably his finishing. He gets in those positions so many times, but today, that's what he's all about. That's, you know, that's brilliant finishing. Yeah, I think he's probably had 2 chances today, and he's stuck them away. So yeah, it's great to have him back. You know, he feeds off the scraps, you know, off Kiefer and makes those runs, makes life easier for a defender because he gives you an outball. So yeah, great to have him back in the fold. And you know, by the looks of it, I don't think he's had any reaction, so it's positive.
That's a good point. Now if we turn to the the worst points in the sense of the game, 2-0 up, and surely just matter of keeping hold of it. But that first goal you gave away, all 3 were sloppy goals. Well, let's look at the first one. Sandercombe coming out, Aaron Pugh running back.
Yeah, it just you know, it was Sunday league. You know, the boys will say it themselves. No communication. You know, I think the shout was for Pugh to head it back. Tim didn't perhaps give him enough information, and in the end, it was neither cleared or headed back, and the lads stuck it in. And we can't do that at this level. You know, teams will score goals for fun if we let that happen. You know, but we've spoke about it afterwards. You know, the boys know they're good top footballers. You know, they know that it was a silly, sloppy mistake, and it's got them back in the game. That said, they didn't really look like scoring even after that. We felt the free kick was harsh. Regardless, you know, it's a great finish. You know, there's not much you can do about that. And then the last goal is, you know, we spent 90% of before the game Saturday, just talking, because there's a lot of young lads about set pieces in this league. That is so often the difference. Just a whip corner, big lads who want to get their head on it, and that's the difference. You know, 3-4 leagues lower, you can get away with marking, you know, 5 yards away and just keep your eye on the ball and doing a bit of ball watching. We can't do that because we've been punished again today.
And in between that, of course, we've got to mention that Truro did go 3-1 up through a certain Jake Ash scoring a penalty.
Yeah, it was funny. Ben Addlesbury was supposed to take them on Saturday, and the penalty got given. And I looked around, and it's gone from last year having Scott Walker and Barry McConnell and Stuart Yetton itching to take it. And I kind of looked around, and there wasn't lots putting their hand up. And I even said to Watto, "You fancy it for your hat-trick?" And he shook his head. Mind you, his penalties are useless. But no, to be honest, I just tried to stick it down the middle. I didn't even get that right. I kind of stuck it to the left, but luckily it went the wrong way. But you know, that puts us in 3-1. You know, it puts us in a great position, and we've got to go on and win games from there. Because if we do, we're good enough to finish top half easily in this league. You know, that was a team who, by all accounts, played, you know, Chelmsford off the park the other day, who are another top side. You know, and we haven't given them a sniff, but they've got a point, and you know, that's what the league table, that's what it will reflect tonight.
Yeah, a lot of people saying, well, 3-1 up, Truro should have, you know, wrapped it up early on. But what can you give us, the supporters? You know, can we learn anything from that game? Is Truro City going to be you know, more of a force than last season, or because of all sorts of things happening, is it going to be a struggle from now until come April?
I mean, obviously it depends. You know, I'm sure. Well, I know Lee wants to bring some extra players in. You know, it's really difficult. You know, Saturday we had 13. You know, and no disrespect to the fellas on the bench. You know, Carney's come on and done really well. You know, we've got Karen who normally plays for the second team, but you know, we've got 2 subs. You know, we haven't got loads to sort of change the game. You know, Billericay had 3 to bring on, so I'm sure once Hodgie can bring in a few more boys, you know, and we have a little bit more depth, I think life will become a lot easier. But I'm sure, or at least I hope, people have seen tonight that, you know, yeah, we're missing a few from last year, but the battling spirit's still there. You know, there's still some really good players out there, and you know, I'm sure the fans that have seen both games are not, you know, we don't look like a side that should be near the bottom of the table. I'm sure we are after tonight, but hopefully on tonight's showing, you know, the home fans, the first time they've seen, you know, a few new boys tonight, they'll see the quality is there. But what we mustn't forget is this was my third 90 minutes. You know, we did miss a chunk of pre-season thanks to you know the various things going on. So we are still probably another week or 2 away from being at full tilt. And if that's 90%, then I think it looks, it looks positive if we can just cut out those silly mistakes.
Now, I've got to ask you about off the pitch scenario, in the sense that it must be so frustrating. You mentioned it yourself. You go away with 2 subs, 300 miles up the road, 2 subs. That's not good enough for a club at this level. Are we going to see any sort of anything happening to get rid of the embargo? Are the players? Do you know what's happening?
Not really. We don't get loads of information. We're led to believe that everything is going to be sorted out. What that means, I don't really know. I think it's just a case of paying these bills off and then the embargo is lifted. But we don't really get much info. To be honest, it's not our problem. What happens on the pitch, that's what we've got to worry about. If we've got 13, we've got 13. That's for everyone else to sort out. If we go out there on the pitch worrying about, we've only got 2 subs. When we're out there, we're going to be in trouble from the start. Yeah, in a perfect world, we'd have, like we did at the start of last season, 5 really strong players to bring off the bench. But we're not there. That's not where we're at. Hopefully, it will sort itself out. It's out of our hands. All I can say is, fingers crossed it is sorted, because without a shadow of a doubt, it'll help if we can bring in some extra bodies and some extra legs to come off the bench. It's going to make a huge difference. So that's all we know at the moment, really.
And of course, you were very close to walking away a couple of weeks ago when the wages weren't paid. The money came through. What happens this time in August if you don't get paid on the due date?
Well, we'll deal with that if that happens. We're assured that it won't. So until that day, there's no point worrying what ifs, because we've been there before. It doesn't help us. We just start feeling sorry for ourselves. So we'll see what happens at the end of this month. We're led to believe that everything's fine. So come the end of the month, we'll see.
Final question, back on about football, not off the pitch. Salisbury on Saturday. Yep. You must be itching to get back out there and sort out what went wrong tonight.
Absolutely. I mean, it starts Thursday. I can envisage an hour of defending corners, just an aerial bombardment on Saturday. But we've got the big players. We shouldn't be a problem. We've got Kiefer and Pewee and myself and Danny Green and Ben Williams. We've got some big boys in there, so we shouldn't be conceding them. So it's not an area where we should be getting exploited. So I'm sure with a little bit of work Thursday we'll be fine. And then Salisbury Saturday. I don't know how they got on tonight, but I know they won Saturday. They're always a strong side, and I think they've invested again in the summer. So I want to get back out there after the frustration of that. And to be honest, I'll take playing rubbish on Saturday and scraping a 1-0 win and it going the other way, because I don't want to come off and feel cheated.